Imagine waking in the dead of a Russian winter night. Something so horrifying forces you to tear through your tent, barefoot, into -30-degree temperatures. That's just the beginning of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, a true story of 9 hikers found dead, with injuries so bizarre, even the most seasoned investigators were left speechless. The official explanation barely scratches the surface of this chilling mystery. The Northern Ural Mountains. February 1959. A desolate, windswept ridge known to the indigenous Mansi people as Kholat Syakhl, meaning Dead Peak. This remote, freezing landscape was the setting for one of history's most baffling and terrifying, unexplained tragedies, the Dyatlov Pass Incident. 9 young, experienced Soviet trekkers set out on an ambitious winter expedition, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. They were experts, equipped for the most extreme conditions. Yet, in the middle of one fatal night, something compelled them to violently slash their way out of their tent and flee down the mountainside, barefoot, into sub-zero darkness. When rescue parties finally found them, the scene defied all logic. Some had frozen to death, miles from shelter. Others, the last survivors, were discovered months later with injuries only explainable by a massive, non-human force, wounds likened to the impact of a car crash. For decades, the official Soviet conclusion, that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force, only fueled exotic theories, secret military tests, infrasound attacks, or even creatures of the snow. But what if the truth, while still horrifying, was rooted not in conspiracy, but in physics? This is the story of how modern science, 60 years later, finally solved the ultimate historical mystery. To understand the true tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass, one must first recognize the skill of the victims. This was not a group of naive adventurers. Dyatlov's team was comprised of highly capable students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, UPI, trained in severe winter trekking. They were attempting a Category 3 expedition, the highest difficulty rating at the time, involving a demanding 350-kilometer route through the unforgiving Northern Urals. Their meticulous preparation and high skill level is fundamental to the mystery. These were people who understood the mountains, the cold, and the necessity of their equipment. Every aspect of the journey was documented through multiple cameras and detailed journals, 6 rolls of film, and 4 cameras found at the scene. They established a careful rhythm, even caching surplus food and heavy equipment in a designated supply storage, a labaz, on January 31st, preparing only for the climb ahead. This preparation underscores the scale of the impending disaster. They had anticipated the worst environmental conditions, yet their measures proved utterly insufficient for the event that followed. The question is, if these experts abandoned their sanctuary, the threat must have been perceived as instantaneous and overwhelming. The group pushed forward. On February 1st, they began moving through the pass, intending to cross the ridge and set up camp on the far side. But strong wind and deteriorating visibility forced them to stop short. They made a crucial, final decision. They pitched their heavy, canvas tent high on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. The diaries traced their path right up to the very last hours, reinforcing that their spirits were good, and the crisis was sudden, not gradual. Zina Kolmogoreva's earlier diary entry provides a chilling piece of thematic foreshadowing. "Today is the last day of civilization," she wrote. While a minor note at the time, it now carries unbearable weight. Dyatlov's decision to pitch the tent high on the exposed slope, rather than retreating a short distance to the relative shelter of the forest below, was a tactical error that maximized their exposure. While it saved them time and effort, this location maximized the risk of snow deposition and wind loading over the ridge. This geographic error placed them directly into the specific meteorological conditions required for a uniquely devastating natural phenomenon. This tragedy, therefore, began with the leader's crucial, final calculation on the mountain top, an error which set the stage for the terrifying events of the night. When the search party arrived weeks later in late February, they found the tent partially collapsed but secured with gear and supplies still inside. The stove, the food, and extra layers of clothing lay untouched. The most immediate and disturbing finding, however, was the canvas itself. There were several major slashes through the thick, heavy Soviet-era canvas, indicating the tent had been violently cut open from the inside. Footprints, clearly identifiable in the hard-packed snow, showed that 9 sets of bare or lightly shod feet, some wearing only socks or a single boot, fled immediately, heading downhill towards the cedar forest, roughly a mile away. The discovery presented the initial, irresolvable paradox. The primary exit of the tent was not blocked by snow. Running out the front door would have taken moments. Slicing through heavy, cold canvas with a knife would have taken considerably longer. Why bypass the door? The fact that they fled immediately and without taking time to retrieve their boots or warm clothing, a certain death sentence in the conditions, suggests the threat they perceived was far more immediate, terrifying, and overwhelming than the certain death from hypothermia. This flight suggests an immediate disorientation or a massive, sensory-based terror that forced an irrational, immediate escape from the confines of their shelter. The first 5 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, found near the cedar tree, and Igor Dyatlov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin, scattered between the tree line and the tent, died primarily of hypothermia. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, stripped down to their underwear, had managed to light a small fire beneath the cedar. Their hands showed defensive wounds and burns, evidence of a desperate, final struggle against the cold. Many victims exhibited paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where, just before succumbing to freezing temperatures, the victim experiences a sudden, intense sensation of heat and strips off their clothes, ironically speeding their death. The hypothermia deaths establish the fundamental environmental factor, the exposure that doomed the first group. But even among the hypothermia victims, there were unusual findings. Slobodin had a minor skull fracture, which may have incapacitated him, suggesting a possible fall or blow during the flight. Crucially, the discovery that some of the bodies found later were wearing clothing scavenged from the first 5 shows that a desperate, yet rational, strategy for survival was employed by the remaining trekkers after the initial panic. The situation escalated into the realm of the truly inexplicable when the final 4 bodies were discovered in May, 3 months later. They were found buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, near a shelter, a snow den, they had desperately constructed. These victims, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brinol, and Alexander Kolevatov, did not die primarily from cold. They died violently. Forensic analysis showed that Nikolai Thibault-Brinol suffered a severe depressed skull fracture. Semyon Zolotaryov also had a severe head injury and fractured ribs. But the most harrowing injuries belonged to Lyudmila Dubinina. She sustained bilateral and symmetrical fractures of 10 ribs, ribs 2 through 7 on the left, and 2 through 5 on the right, and massive internal hemorrhaging in her heart's right atrium. The forensic expert, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, noted that the force required to inflict these injuries was immense, similar to the impact of a high-speed vehicle or the pressure from a shock wave. Crucially, these catastrophic internal injuries were unaccompanied by any external soft tissue bruising. The hemorrhaging into the cardiac muscle and pleural cavity proved unequivocally that these 4 hikers were alive when this massive force struck them, meaning the fatal event occurred hours after the initial panicked flight. The sheer magnitude of the force, distributed across the chest and skull, yet leaving the outer skin intact, rules out human involvement, such as fighting or blows from blunt weapons. The injury's profile demands a massive, non-local compressive force, strengthening the initial, mysterious conclusion of a compelling natural force. The final pieces of evidence were interpreted by a fearful Soviet public as proof of a cover-up. First, there was the ghastly state of Dubinina's body, found submerged in the icy stream. She was missing her tongue, eyes, and parts of her lips. This led to immediate speculation of ritualistic murder or creature attack. However, Forensic science offers a straightforward, though grim, explanation: natural postmortem decomposition and scavenging by small animals in running water, which target the soft, exposed tissues first. Second, traces of radiation were found on some of the victims' clothing, particularly a sweater believed to belong to Krivonischenko. This fueled theories of secret weapons testing. While the Soviet government did immediately seal the case files, leading to decades of distrust, the presence of radiation had rational explanations. One hiker had lived in the contaminated zone following the Kyshtym nuclear disaster, and Krivonischenko worked at a secret nuclear facility. The trace amounts found were not lethal and were consistent with residual exposure from camp lanterns or prior work. The combination of unexplained trauma, perceived mutilation, radiation traces, and government secrecy created the perfect foundation for the legends involving Yetis, the KGB, or spectral lights. But the answer lay in revisiting the very force the Soviets had cited: nature, acting in a way rarely seen. For years, the avalanche theory was dismissed. The slope angle on Kholat Syakhl was simply too shallow, less than 30 degrees, for a traditional, gravity-driven avalanche. It was a geographical impossibility. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, narrowing the focus to 3 environmental factors: an avalanche, a slab avalanche, or a hurricane. Then, in 2021, 2 researchers, Johann Gaum and Alexander M. Puzrin, published a sophisticated mathematical model that finally provided the definitive mechanism. The key lies in understanding the immense power of wind loading. Because Dyatlov pitched the tent near a ridge, the area was subjected to powerful, katabatic winds that carried snow from the higher peak and deposited it onto the lower, lee side of the slope where the tent sat. Over time, this process created an extremely dense, rigid, and brittle layer of snow, a slab, directly above the campsite. The slab avalanche scenario works because it doesn't require a steep slope, only a fragile, rigid layer that breaks under its own internal stress, often triggered by a small change in temperature or wind pressure. Once this slab fractured, it didn't flow like powder, it hit the tent like a dense, solid block, delivering a distributed, compressive force. Precisely the kind of high-pressure impact required to explain the internal, non-bruised trauma found on the victims. This single mechanism resolves the greatest geographical contradiction of the case. This scientific model finally creates a single, terrifying chain of events that accounts for every piece of forensic evidence. The initial impact and panic. The sudden, catastrophic force of the low-angle slab hitting the tent was immense. It likely caused immediate acoustic shock, disorientation, and localized trauma, forcing the panic escape. The hikers, fearing a massive secondary avalanche, did not take the time to use the door. They violently slashed the tent open to escape the immediate crushing weight, fleeing barefoot and minimally clothed toward the relative safety of the tree line. Exposure and sacrifice. 5 hikers, caught furthest from shelter or too injured to continue, succumbed to hypothermia, some dying by the cedar tree after desperately attempting to build a fire. The fatal decision. The 4 survivors, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brinol, and Kolevatov, were the strongest or perhaps the least injured. They made the rational choice to build a snow den, an insulated shelter, near the ravine, a natural tactical defense against the wind and cold. They even scavenged clothes from the hypothermia victims to improve their chances. What happened on Dead Peak remained obscured by secrecy for over half a century. But today, the evidence allows us to draw a clear line from the first, panicked slash in the tent canvas to the massive forensic trauma found months later. Here are 3 verifiable facts from the original case files. The tent cut. The search party found several slashes in the heavy canvas tent, confirming it was cut open from the inside. Fatal trauma profile. Victim Lyudmila Dubinina sustained a massive injury, bilateral and symmetrical fractures of 10 ribs, with no external signs of bruising, a finding that indicated a massive, compressive force rather than a human blow. The official ceiling. The initial Soviet investigation in May 1959 concluded the hikers died due to a compelling natural force, and the case files were immediately sent to a secret archive, fueling decades of secrecy and distrust.